Deputy National Editor of the Hindu. Sorry for the delay. We had technical issues. I'm sorry for the delay, and let's get on with it. So uh, today we are going to look at what's happening in the U.S. elections. Barely as days left for the presidential elections to commence in the U.S. on November 5 today. Traditionally, elections are held on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November in election year, and all the 50 states in the US will go to polls. That said, because they have provisions for early voting, close to 81 million, or in fact more than 81 million people have already voted among the 180 million eligible voters across the United States. So what will you do in this video? In this video, we'll look at what is happening in these elections, who is projected to win, what are the factors that will determine the winner, and the importance of what are called the swing states in particular. We'll also look into the scenarios for each candidate to help the candidate win. So what's happening? So basically, pollsters in the United States are nearly unanimous in calling this as one of the closest presidential elections ever. Let's look at what this polling website 538.com is saying. They simulated polling data, and based on polling data, they were able to find that out of 100 simulations, Kamala Harris was winning 50 of the simulations, and Trump was winning 49 times out of those 100 simulations. That means that this election is almost a dead heat. Almost what? It is a dead heat, and the chances are as good as a coin flip. So essentially, pollsters like 538 are calling this the closest presidential elections ever. Now let's look at what ace pollster Nate Silver is saying. Nate Silver is saying that the probability of Trump winning the Electoral College is 50.4%, and the probability of Kamala Harris winning this contest is 49.2%. This also means that the election is a dead heat. But there is a quirk here. Nate Silver also says that Vice President Harris, the probability of her winning the popular vote is close to 77%, and Trump winning is just 23%. So why is this quirk? In any election, you would assume that the candidate who wins the popular vote should actually technically win the elections, but that's not the case in the U.S. elections. In the U.S. elections, it is possible for the candidate to lose the popular vote, win the Electoral College, and win the elections. And this has happened in the past also. Let's look at what happened in 2000. In the 2000 elections, the elections was between the Republican George W. Bush and Democratic candidate Al Gore. And George Bush won only 47.9% of the vote. Al Gore won 48.4% of the vote, and Al Gore therefore won the popular vote. But in terms of the Electoral College, George Bush was able to narrowly win the Electoral College. He won 271 votes, and Al Gore just won 266 votes. This was in 2000. In 2016, just barely a decade ago, the main candidates were Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And if you notice the elections in 2016, Hillary won the popular vote. She won 65 million votes, while Donald Trump barely won 63 million votes. In percentage terms, Hillary Clinton had 48% of the popular vote. Trump had only 46%. But in terms of the Electoral College vote, Trump got 304 Electoral College votes, while Hillary Clinton got only 227 Electoral College votes. So the Electoral College is what determines who will win the election. So what is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is basically a collection of voters who determine who will be the president or the vice president. And each state in the United States has a set of Electoral College votes. If you notice here, this is the map of the United States. California, Texas, and Florida. These are the states with the highest Electoral College votes, followed by New York. So what happens is this number 54 that you see in California is the sum of the number of senators who are from California, and the number of Congress representatives from the state of California. The same is the case with Texas, Florida, and so on. Now, if you look at the Electoral College, if you add up all these numbers, it comes to 538, right? And if you notice here that This is a map of uh, uh, the current map of United States, where and it shows which party is favored to win where, right? Now, because the US is a strong federalist republic, the winner of the presidential elections is determined by the composition of the Electoral College. Why is it that you could win the Electoral College by not winning the popular vote? That you can explain using demography. Let's look at this visual, for example. Now, this is an urbanization map of United States, right? If you notice here, some states are largely urbanized. That is, California has 95% urbanization, especially the ones in the coast are largely urbanized, while those in the middle and in the southern part of the United States, they are largely rural areas, right? And if you also look at the population figures, not just the urban population, show me the population figures, please. Next graphic, yeah. If you look at the population figures, the population is concentrated largely in the coast and in the south, Texas, California, New York, New Jersey, and the Midwest. And you have less populous states in the Northwest, and also in the middle and in the south. Now, all these states with small populations and largely rural populations tend to favor the Republicans. We'll see why. But because the number of such states is quite high, and the Electoral College is determined by cumulatively adding the total number of voters, Electoral College voters in each state, and therefore it is possible for a candidate to win by winning a plurality of the states. And because this is a federalist states, each state matters in determining who the president is, right? Let's move on. For a simple parallel, let's imagine Electoral College to be the number of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha members for each state in India, and the sum of it will determine the number of Electoral College voters, and they will tend to go on to vote for the for the president, right? So if you look at this map, for example, this is a counties map of 2020. Counties are basically like districts, right? If you notice, the Republicans have won most of the counties in the south and in the sparsely populated north, while the coastal areas and some of the southern areas are won by the Democrats. And these are urban areas, as you showed in the previous visual, and this largely are rural areas. So even if they're sparsely populated, in these counties, the Republicans have done pretty well, and that's why it's always possible for the Republicans to win the Electoral College despite not winning the popular vote, because much of the population is concentrated here, right? Let's move on. So now let's get to which states favor the Democrats and which states favor the Republicans, right? If you look at this graphic, the states that are marked blue favor the Democrats, the states that are marked red favor the Republicans, and then you have this grayish states which are not marked in red or blue. Now, these are the states that are what are called the swing states, right? Let's explain which are the things. Look, these states are in the Midwest here, and also some in the South, right? So let me name what are the swing states. Yeah. So if you look here, yeah. So if you look at these are the first 7 are all the swing states: Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. I'll show you the map again. Wait. Yeah. Okay. So this map tells you which are the swing states. The ones that are neither marked blue or red, that's Nevada in the west, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Rest of the other states are expected to vote either Democratic or Republican. The colors of some states are shaded in lighter tones because there the elections are somewhat competitive. Let's take Florida, for example. Okay, yeah. Florida, if you look at it, the Republicans are expected to win, but just by around 6 points. So that's the reason why you notice that this shade of Florida is not dark red but light red, right? Now, if you look at the swing states, right, they are also geographically contiguous in some sense, right? These C states, that is Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, right? These T states are what are called the Midwest states. There are other Midwest states as well, but these are the swing states here. And these states are also called a part of what are called the Rust Belt states. By Rust Belt, we mean these states had used to be manufacturing hubs before some years back, but what has happened is that there has been deindustrialization in these areas, and which is why they use the term Rust Belt. And there has also been a movement of population away from these states in the last few decades. In comparison to the Rust Belt states, you have what are called the Sun Belt states. That is Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and these states are part of a zone which are either has desert weather or subtropical weather, right? And which is why they are called the Sun Belt states, right? So what's happening in these states? If you check what Nate Silver is saying, according to Nate Silver, based on the average of all the major polls for these states, in Pennsylvania, Trump is ahead by a very marginal 0.3 percentage points. In North Carolina, again, he's marginally ahead by 1.1 percentage points. In Michigan, the Democrats are ahead by just 1 percentage point. Georgia, again, Republicans ahead by 1 percentage point. Wisconsin, Democrats mildly ahead by 1 point, and in Arizona, again, Trump leading by 2.4 percentage points, right? So, if let's get to the scenarios later, but essentially, some states are led by Ms. Harris, and some states are being led by Mr. Trump, according to the polls, right? And also, these leads are well within the error margin. Most of these polls, the error margin is close to 3%, and therefore this could go either way. If the polls are wrong by even a minor margin, you could see massive shifts. And probably if you see if in the, for example, in the Rust Belt, if the polls are underestimating Ms. Harris's performance, then she would clearly win these states. On the other hand, in the Sun Belt, if Mr. Trump's performance is being underestimated with the polls, then it will be a clear win for Mr. Trump in the Sun Belt. Right? Now, the question that arises is, why are these states the swing states? What is it about these states that make them, battleground states? What is about these states that make them competitive, right? While other states are either overwhelmingly Democratic, leaning Democratic, or likely Democratic, and some states are leaning Republican, likely Republican, and heavily supporting Republican. These are battleground states. Why is that these are only battleground states? For that, we need to understand what is the profile of Democratic and Republican voters. So, right. So the Democratic Party, which Ms. Harris represents, has several factions and ideological divisions. It is broadly categorized as a social liberal party and a centrist party, and one that favors a greater role for the government in the economy, and is inclusive of different sections which include progressives, moderates, and so on. The support for the Democrats is more concentrated in the urban areas. In states which have very high urban populations, and in the coast, that's where the support for the Democratic Party is higher. It's very high among voters with graduate education. It's very high among racial and linguistic minorities, especially African Americans, Indian Americans, and Hispanics. Section, the minority vote segment, Mr. Biden, the current president, had a much bigger lead against Mr. Trump in the 2020 elections. In the 2024 elections, on the other hand, that lead has narrowed slightly, right? But support from this coalition does not always translate into votes, because in voters in urban areas, especially youth, minorities, they tend to vote in lower numbers relative to other sections, right? So the nature of the demography and even the topography and economy of the states can be an indication of whether voters are preferring the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate. Let me show you another visual. Right. Yeah. So this was an article in the New York Times that looked at topography specifically to show if there is a clear-cut difference in topography between voters who prefer for voters who prefer Hillary Clinton or the Democratic Party, and voters who prefer Donald Trump or the Republican Party. Now look at these images, right? In places where there is strong urbanization, right, where there are very little green spaces, right, more concrete, you would notice that Ms. Clinton was winning by a large margin. This is from 2016 polls, and this difference largely holds true even today, right? But in places which are much greener, where you have golf garden, you have agrarian areas, you have places with golf greens and so on. In those areas, Mr. Trump was doing far better, right? And when you do a color composite of precincts where Ms. Clinton or the Democrats were ahead and where Mr. Trump was ahead, places which had much more concrete and less green, right? There, Ms. Clinton was winning by large margins, while in places which are much more green, Mr. Trump was winning in large margins, right? And therefore, this clearly, in terms of the topography, in terms of places with large number of farms, Mr. Trump was winning more. Large number of forests, Mr. Trump was winning more. Places with developed land in terms of cities and towns, Ms. Clinton was winning more, right? That doesn't mean that he was not winning in urban areas, but relatively speaking, places which had higher developed land and this thing, Mrs. Trump was leading, Ms. Clinton was leading in 2016. Now, this differentiation in patterns in Democratic and Republican voting has been true even now, right? Now, let us go even further and look at 3 or 4 variables that have very distinctive Republican and Democratic support, right? Let's look first at urban-rural areas, right? This is an exit poll, a Pew survey that came out in 2022, right? If you look at Democrats, the Democratic support base, it's largely urban, right? Urban is dark blue, so largely urban. Almost 28% of the 28% of the overall voters were urban voters for the Democratic Party in 2020. That fell slightly to 27%. The suburban vote increased to 57% from 55%, and the rural vote barely fell from 17 to 16%. On the other hand, for the Republicans, rural vote are much higher. Close to 36% of the rural of their vote base is rural, right? And suburban vote is also equally high, but the urban vote is relatively low, right? So there's a clear difference. In urban areas, Democratic Party is doing better. In rural areas, Republican parties are doing better. And in suburban areas, which is neither urban or rural, it's a 50-50 mix, right? They almost have the same support base, right? If you notice, there's a slight increase in suburban voters for Democratic Party in 2022. This was 2022 midterm elections, and this was after the Roe v. versus Wade decision, that is that protected abortion, that was overturned by the Supreme Court, and there was a slight uptick in suburban votes for the Democratic Party that came largely from women voters, right? Let's move on to the other variable that clearly distinguishes Republican and Democratic votes. If you look at religious affiliation, right? Among people who are religiously unaffiliated, right? Who are not overtly mentioning what their religion is, right? You will notice that the Democrats have much higher votes, much better support base than Republicans, right? On the other hand, among Catholic voters and Protestant voters, the Catholic voters are more or less the same for Democratic and Republican. Republicans have a mild edge, but among Protestant voters, there is a big edge. Now, among these Protestant voters, there is one category who are called the evangelical voters rather, and there the Republican Party has had a significant edge for years, and that has helped Mr. Trump also do well, right? Now, let us look at the third variable, that is education. Okay. Now, if you look at people who have just passed high school or less, right, there you would notice that the Republicans have far better, support, right? In 2020, the presidential elections, 34%, or rather, we'll put it this way, among the Republican supporters, 34% of the Republican support base comes from, people who have higher education or less education. In terms of graduate and postgraduates, on the other hand, they overwhelmingly favor the Democratic Party, right? So if people who finish college and also go on to do post graduation, they tend to be Democratic supporters. People who have not gone to college or not finished college, they tend to support the Republicans, right? This is a third variable. Now, if you take these variables and use those variables to categorize where states are, right, and which states are more urbanized, which states are not, and so on, then you'll notice significant patterns. Now let us look at urbanization, right? And in the y-axis, I have taken the difference in vote shares between Democratic Party and Republican Party. In the x-axis, I have taken what is called urbanization. Greater the value, greater the urbanization in these states. And this is greater the difference here, more the vote for Democratic Party, right? So if you see here, all these states, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, West Virginia, Arkansas, Alabama, Idaho, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and so on, these states are largely rural, right? And look at this. These rural states are all having or overwhelmingly pro-Republican, right? That means the vote share difference is in the favor of Republican Party, right? But as you go further in terms of urbanization, you'll notice states like New York, New Jersey, California, Maryland, Illinois, etc., etc. These states tend to favor the Democratic Party. There are minor exceptions like Vermont and Maine. These are far northeastern states, rural states, but they have always been Democratic states. There are some exceptions. But that said, these states which are highly urbanized tend to vote for the Democrats, and these states which are largely rural tend to vote for the Republicans. Now look at the states in the middle, right? Now here the urbanization is relatively low in these states: Georgia, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and so on. And these states, Florida, and so on, these states have middling urbanization, okay? And many of these tend also to be swing states. So all the swing states that we discussed slightly before now, they tend to fall between they tend to have middling urbanization. So states like Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, New Hampshire, all of these. But in specific, the swing states include Georgia, Arizona, and Pennsylvania here, right, and Michigan, right. Iowa also, people say is close. I'll get to this later. So this graphic tells you that swing states have a high cross section of both urban and rural voters, and that's the reason why the difference between the support for the Republicans and Democrats is almost negligible. On the other hand, the highly urbanized states and the highly rural states have clear differences. Let's move on to the next variable, and in terms of graduation, right? This is also very clear. If you have very high graduation, right, states which have higher percentage of graduation, they tend to be Democratic. States like Massachusetts, Maryland, Vermont, New York, etc., etc., they tend to vote for the Democrats. While states with very low graduation numbers, they are largely supporting the Republicans. Again, states with middling numbers, right, like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, Michigan, these states that fall in the middle, they are competitive, right? So again, in terms of graduation numbers, these states have middling numbers. That's the reason why they're competitive. Let's look at the other variable, that's non-white population, minority population. In terms of minority population, again, if the states with higher minority population, this way, right? The states with higher minority population tend to be slightly more Democratic, and those with lower minority population, or which are what is called whiter states, they tend to be Republican. But there are again exceptions. There are states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. They have very low minority population, but they are competitive. That's because they also have a larger number of college graduates. While on the other hand, states like Arizona and Georgia have higher minority populations, but they are competitive. I'll get to this later. And this is somewhere in the middle. So why is that these two states, even though they have higher minority population, they're competitive, they should technically be more supportive towards the Democrats? There's a reason for that, and that we should look at in the next graph. Yeah. Okay, minority population. I think we missed one graph. Yeah, Christian affiliated population. Yeah, this is important. In places like Georgia and Georgia in particular, you notice that the Christian affiliated population is very high. And Christian affiliated populations, people who are religiously minded, especially among Protestants, they tend to favor the Republicans. So Georgia has a high Christian population, which is why, even though it has a high minority population, it is not. It is competitive. If it is high minority, it should be Democrats. It is not. That's because it also has a high Christian population, and the higher Christian population state tends to favor the Republicans. So now you have a picture as to why these swing states are the swing states and why they are competitive. So now let's get to back to our map and see. Look at the configuration of which state supports Democrats and which state supports Republicans, and you'll notice as we looked into those graphs, the support for the Democrats are concentrated on the coast, and in the rural areas, you see the Republicans supporting the states supporting the Republicans. Now, if you don't look into the swing states and only look at states that are likely Democratic or likely Republican, then the Democrats have an advantage. They have 226 electoral votes. Republicans have 219 electoral votes. Right now, what does Nate Silver say? He says that based on polling, latest polling data, Arizona is technically expected to vote Republican. Right. So let us make it Republican. Okay, what happens? It immediately turns 230 to 226, right? Then let's move on to Wisconsin, or rather Michigan is expected to vote Democrat. So let us assume this is Democrat. Okay, so now it becomes 241 to 230, right? Then let's look at Nevada. Nevada is very close, but the recent New York Times poll, Siena poll, which is a far more authentic poll and considered one of the most reputed polls by most pollsters. If that poll is true and Nevada votes Democratic, yeah, if it votes Democratic, again the advantage becomes higher for Miss Harris. She's expected to win 247, and Trump is expected to win 230. Right now, on the other hand, in North Carolina actually voted for Trump in 2000 in 2020, and if that scenario is repeated, and Nate Silver's averages also suggest that North Carolina, Mr. Trump is marginally ahead. So if you give North Carolina to Mr. Trump, it becomes very close. It's 247 to 246. Now it boils down to two states, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Before I make a guess as to this, who is what. These states which candidate these states are going to prefer. I'd like to say something about these two states. Wisconsin is a very difficult state to poll, right? Although in 2020 Wisconsin voted for Mr. Biden, this state, the polls got it actually very wrong. So they expected Mr. Biden to will be a larger margin, but the margins were much more narrow in Wisconsin, and polls were generally wrong in Wisconsin in 2016 also, right? But for now, Wisconsin is very close, and Nate Silver says, what does he say? Let's check. Where is that? And Nate Silver says the Democrats are ahead by 1 point. So let's assume that Wisconsin shifts towards the Democrats. Okay, so now it's 256 and 247. So finally, let's look at Georgia. Georgia again, let's assume it's Republican. Last time, barely by around 10,000 votes, if I'm not wrong, Georgia had voted for the Democrats. There was a lot of controversy in Georgia, but thanks to a large turnout by the African American community in particular, you saw Georgia shifting to the Democrats. But this year, Mr. Trump has made a comeback there, and in Georgia, the Republicans are favored by 1 point here. So let's give Georgia to the Republicans, right? Okay, so then Mr. Trump now has an advantage, 262 to 257. So all this analysis, which is based on data from recent polls, tell you that this election is going to be very close. And it also tells you that Pennsylvania, with 19 electoral votes, higher than any other swing state, can become the most important and most pivotal swing state. So the candidate who wins Pennsylvania can be expected to win the election. So if Mr. Trump wins this, if Mr. Trump wins Pennsylvania, then he wins 281, that is more than 270. 270 votes are required to win the Electoral College, and he'll become the next president of the United States for his second term. If, on the other hand, Pennsylvania goes to Miss Harris, then she becomes president now. Now, what are the other scenarios that can help her become the president? Let's say she loses Pennsylvania. Yeah, okay. Let's say she loses Nevada, right? Then even then she wins the election. So it is a must for the Democrats to win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, all three, and they can afford to lose in Nevada. If she loses in Pennsylvania, on the other hand, then she has to win Nevada and win either of North Carolina or Georgia. And let's assume North Carolina, which New York Times is saying is favoring the Democrats. If it surprises us, and if North Carolina, which also has a large college graduate population, if it narrowly votes for Miss Harris, then there is a chance that she might win the election. So these are the different scenarios, and it will all boil down to the different different swing states and what's going to happen there. Something very interesting came about in the last week or so. There is a pollster called Ann Selzer and Company, which is a very highly and reputed pollster. And that pollster suggested that Kamala Harris is leading in Iowa. Now, this is a surprise because Iowa has been favored to be a Republican stronghold, but still she says that Mr. Harris is leading there. And the reason why she expects Iowa to vote for Ms. Harris is that she's saying that a large number of women voters are preferring to vote for the Democrats because of what happened during Mr. Trump's administration with respect to the Roe versus Wade legislation on the abortion issue. This issue in particular determined the closeness of the 2022 midterm elections. And Ms. Selzer believes that in Iowa, women voters are actually moving towards Ms. Harris, and there is a possibility that she was ahead 47-44 according to their poll. And if this unexpected event happens, then Ms. Harris can still triumph. That's it. The important point is pollsters are not always right. And in fact, in 2016 and 2020, the pollsters underestimated Mr. Trump's vote. So if you can make an assumption that they if they get Mr. Trump's support base wrong, then Mr. Trump would easily win this election. Now the question then arises: why did they get 2016 and 2020 wrong? Now, one of the assumptions is that the pollsters were not able to reach out to Trump voters who were hesitant to talk to pollsters, and that's the reason why they were undersampled and underrepresented in the respondents that these pollsters had, and that's the reason why these polls got the support base for Mr. Trump wrong. Now, if that possibility still holds now, then Mr. Trump will surely win. But having said that, it is also the case that many pollsters have corrected for this by not so robust method. What they have done is that they have sampled more Republican voters in their base sample in order to correct for the possible mistake of not getting Trump voters in their sample. They have already oversampled in their base itself. But good pollsters or very much more reputable pollsters like New York Times, Siena, or even Ann Selzer have not done that. They have only tried to keep their polling process much more robust by reaching out to more sections, by choosing their samples, choosing broader samples, and ensuring that early voters are not missed, and so on. And they have not deliberately oversampled Republicans, voters a priori or prior to their setting their poll. So those pollsters are claiming that this election could also turn towards Ms. Harris, and uh, therefore, it's very difficult to say as to who will be right. If undersampling of Republican voters have happened again because of Trump voters not answering pollsters, then Mr. Trump is expected to win. But on the other hand, if pollsters have got their method right, and those pollsters who have not done this, extrapolation and so on, and done a robust poll, if what they say is true, then Ms. Harris can possibly squeak through. So that's the state of the U.S. elections. We'll get to know tomorrow what happens. We'll come up with another video after the elections, and we'll look at specifically what happened in those swing states, and we'll tell you in more detail as to how Mr. Trump won or if Ms. Harris won. As of now, it's a dead heat, and we're back to square one. We said in the start of the video, this is one of the closest presidential elections ever, and that's how it's turning out to be. So we'll just take some questions from our audience. Yeah. Yeah. There's one question. Yeah, let's look at this question. Yeah. Siva Perumal says that India needs world peace and therefore India needs Donald Trump, and we like Honorable President Donald Trump, sir. Okay. It's not a question, rather a view. I would say to that if Mr. Trump is elected, there won't be much change in US foreign policy except for probably what's going to happen in Ukraine. The current administration, Biden administration, has supplied weapons to Ukraine, has been proactive in helping Ukraine thwart the Russian invasion without taking the war directly to Russia, because Russia has a nuclear power and it has also threatened the use of nuclear weapons if it is attacked conventionally by any of the NATO powers. So they have supplied Ukraine with weapons, and the war has continued. But if Mr. Trump comes to power, there is the possibility that Mr. Trump might seek a way to end the war. It could be in the favor of the Russians, perhaps. So that could be one difference from what this administration has done. But that said, on the West Asia front, the other major war that is raging in West Asia, where Israel is bombing Gaza, Israel is bombing Lebanon now, and tensions are high between Israel and Iran. I expect Trump administration to basically continue this policy of favoring Israel no matter what, and also being also a bit more overtly pro-Israel. The current administration at least has tried to enforce a ceasefire by talks, but I don't think there will be a major change in US policy if Mr. Trump comes to power. I'll take the next question. Who is influencing swing states more and how? That question, yeah. Yeah, that's what we tried to explain in our graphic. The swing states are those states where the sample of pro-Democrat and pro-Republican voters are more or less equal, and the profile of Democratic voters, that is urban voters and college graduates and so on, is equally high, as is the number of rural voters, the religiously minded voters for Republicans. That's the reason why these swing states are quite competitive. Now, what will determine who wins there will be how these sections turn out. In 2020, in states like Arizona, Georgia in particular, African American voters turned out in large numbers and voted for Mr. Biden. There was also a very solid campaign to get out voters from these sections, which featured legislators like Stacey Abrams, sport figures and so on, who really popularized the need to come and vote against Mr. Trump, and that helped the Democratic Party win. That said, this time around, the enthusiasm that was there among minority voters is not that high for Ms. Harris, even though Ms. Harris comes from a minority background. That's because of several reasons, which include the fact that Hispanics, for example, are not that enthusiastic to vote for Ms. Harris because of the immigration issue, perhaps, or the African Americans are conservative African Americans who are voting on religious basis want to vote for Mr. Trump because of his position on abortion and so on. So and then there is also other minorities like Arab Americans or even some progressive Americans who are dismayed at the Biden administration and Ms. Harris's positions on the Gaza issue, on what they're doing vis-a-vis Israel and Gaza, and they're not enthused to vote for the Democrats. If, on the other hand, the Democrats make it a strong campaign, suggesting that Mr. Trump's victory will be a danger to democracy, some of the progressives might be compelled to vote despite their anger and dismay over the Gaza policy. But it remains to be seen if that happens. So essentially, it will all boil down to turnout, I believe. Which party turns out more of their partisans, more of the people who are aligned with their views, that party can be expected to win. Any other question? Yeah. Mr. Prashant asked this question: what are the ways of Trump winning the presidency? Yeah, as I said, the Republicans have an inherent electoral college advantage. If the Republican candidate was not this polarizing, and then there is a possibility that again, this is just a hypothetical answer. You might have seen more moderates voting for the Republican Party, unlike partisans. But that said, it is very clear that Republican partisans, conservatives in particular, social conservatives, fiscal conservatives, and so on, they are strongly behind Mr. Trump as the Republican candidate, despite all his warts, despite the fact that he supported the insurrection that happened on Jan 6 in 2021, and despite the fact that his performance during the COVID period was not particularly good. Despite these factors, Republican voters have strongly preferred Mr. Trump, and that's why he has a high floor, which is why, despite his conviction, he's actually technically a convicted criminal, and still he's a Republican candidate, and nothing sticks on him. So he has a very high floor. But in order to cross the barrier of the barrier that allows him to trump over the pun intended, over the Democratic candidate, he would require support from other sections also, and that's happening to some extent. If some Black Americans or African Americans, some Hispanics, and some Indian American voters shift away from their from the traditional positions of voting for the Democrats, then Mr. Trump might come trumps. Yeah, thank you. I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much. We'll do another video after the election results are out. Please subscribe and join the Hindu channel. Thank you so much. Okay.